welcome to the Deakin Alumni webinar with Professor Greg Barton. Professor Greg Barton is Research Professor and Chair of Global Islamic Politics at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation. He is one of Australia's leading scholars of both modern Indonesia and of terrorism and countering violent extremism. Over the past 20 years, he has undertaken extensive research on Indonesian politics and society, especially in the role of Islam as both a constructive and disruptive force. He has been active in interfaith dialogue initiatives and has a deep commitment to building understanding of Islam and Muslim society. Now over to you now, Greg.
Thank you, everyone. It's really nice to be able to do this first webinar for the year. And as usual, I have a large slide set with more slides than we probably need, but these slides are available to you to look through in your own time. So they're really a framing device to move quickly through a big topic today. I want to try and do several things. I want to talk about the particular problem we face in the age of Islamic State in our region, in Australia and in Southeast Asia, and talk about some specifics, a little historical background, but also touch upon what we understand about countering violent extremism, as opposed, for example, to countering terrorism as a tactical response that's well developed. Countering violent extremism tries to go more holistically upstream as well as downstream and address issues of preventing, as far as possible, recruitment, radicalisation, and of course violence, and then working with existing dynamics to try and work with community to turn things around. So I'll get into that at the end of things, but I want to start by looking at making sense of the threat of terrorism in general terms, because I think there's a real danger that we can be so gripped by our sense of anxiety about terrorism that we take it out of all proportion. And of course, that's what terrorism is about. It's about invoking terror because people want to try and bring about some sort of political change. That political change may be couched in religious language or other ideological language, but one of the definitions of terrorism is it's the use of violence or the intimidation threat of violence to bring about some sort of political change, as opposed to, example, hate crime or regular criminal violence. So one of the best ways of framing this issue is to look at the Global Terrorism Index done by the Institute for Peace and Economics. It's 3 editions out now, the last edition late last year, based on data from the START Maryland, University of Maryland International Database on Terrorism. So when you look at the data, the map makes it very clear. There's 5 countries that in recent years have accounted for pretty much 4/5 of all deaths from terror attacks. So we have Nigeria, which has suffered from bad governance, new government now and struggling to reform, but still a long way to go. We have, unfortunately, recently conflict in Yemen, which has made things very much worse there. But before that, the pairing of Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan and Pakistan, together with Nigeria, accounted for almost 80% of all deaths from terrorism. So when you do the international ranking, you see those 5, now 6 countries coming out disproportionately at the top of the list. And for the purposes of our discussion, notice that Southeast Asia gets a look in there, moving down the list with Thailand and problems in the south of the Philippines, putting them on the list at number 12 in the Philippines, number 15 for Thailand. So serious problems, but nothing like the existential threat represented by terrorism in those half dozen countries. If we look at another product from that same institute, the also annual Global Peace Index, which is similar sort of thing but concerned with violence more generally, we can see that the 2 maps largely line up. A difference, though, when it comes to the Global Peace Index in our region is that most of Southeast Asia shares the same level of high levels of peace, low levels of violence and instability, as does Australia, whereas there have been relatively more terror attacks in Southeast Asia. But the takeaway from this is that our corner of the world is fairly benign. Terrorism is an ongoing problem that we'll be talking about. It can't be ignored, but it's not an existential threat in our corner of the world. Violence is a problem. The Global South suffers disproportionately from terror violence, the countries I mentioned, but also other countries in Africa, in Asia and the Middle East suffer disproportionately from terror attacks. Of course, we've had horrible things happen in Paris, in Nice, in Orlando, etc. but the regular reoccurring attacks occur in the global south, and it's in the case of Islamist movements like Islamic State, a fundamentalist extremist movement claiming to defend Muslims, but mostly most of its victims being fellow Muslims, fellow Sunni Muslims, and it's something we need to frame. Violence in general terms is an enormous global problem. So the Institute of Peace and Economics breaks it down this way. When you look at it, you realise that if we could, and this is the whole reason for the Institute, if we could work on conflict resolution and peace building, we'd get an automatic economic dividend of a very substantial amount. But most of the violence comes from military conflict, not necessarily state on state, but civil wars, and from interpersonal violence. So domestic violence, violent assaults, which tend to be predominantly driven by people who are in relationships who know each other, even more than stranger violence. These are enormous problems, and of course you could add to that in a different realm, problems of youth suicide, which is a serious problem in Australia. Against all of that, terrorism is really a minor problem, so we need to put terrorism in context. It's not an existential threat. It's not the biggest concern about violence and harm. It's a factor we're going to have to live with. It's going to be around for a long time. We need to make sure that our response to it is as proportionate as it can be and as effective as it can be, and that the things that we do in responding to violent extremism are as far as possible things that make society better, not degrade it. In Southeast Asia, there are other problems to do with violent extremism beyond terrorism. So we've had famously in Indonesia protests against the Chinese Christian governor of Jakarta as he runs for election to that office. He replaced the elected Joko Widodo, who's now president, and became, as his deputy, became the governor. So now he's facing for the first time election to that office. Very popular, very successful, but his opponents have taken sectarian politics as a way of targeting him, seeing it as his weakness. So 12th of December last year, massive rallies in Jakarta, more than 500,000, perhaps 750,000 people. It has to be said they were peaceful, and that's a very good thing. But it's still a worrying sign of one of the issues of our time, which is popularist politics. We see it with Donald Trump, we see it with Brexit, we see it with Marine Le Pen's tilt for power in France, etc., etc. And it's mostly not violent, but it makes those who would pursue violent ideologies, it gives them more cover and more material to work with. In the case of Islamic State in our region, the basic argument of this movement, given its ideological position, is to claim to be the authoritative interpreter of Islam. And specifically, it claims that those who don't follow their caliphate, their vision, are not proper Muslims at all. They're kafir, they're murtads, they're apostates. So this accusation of accusing somebody of not being a proper Muslim is called takfir, or a takfiri behavior. And it's regarded as a very, very poor form throughout Islamic history. To presume to judge somebody else's faith is regarded as very poor form. Of course, modern fundamentalists break with good grace and good practice. We have some specific terror threats, as I alluded to earlier, in Southeast Asia that are really quite serious, and that's why the Philippines and Thailand feature as highly as they do. In the case of the Philippines, there have been long-running problems in the south of the Philippines, largely to do with Muslim minority claims on territorial control. Most of those claims have been addressed through a series of peace processes, but at the same time we've had a series of splinter breakaway groups that have resisted the outcome of peace processes. And the most significant splinter group at the moment is, or at least one of the more violent groups, is the Abu Sayyaf group, responsible this week, once again sad news, the decapitation murder of a European hostage. You might ask the question why this group could be successful in maintaining a presence given years of work against them. It's because they control a small archipelago where they have a degree of superiority with their technology. They are a criminal ragtag group that looks more like a criminal kidnapping for ransom group than it does a disciplined ideological movement, but they've aligned in the last 2 years with Islamic State, and that threatens to give them discipline and focus in a way that that criminal group by itself wouldn't have. They make use of asymmetric technology, so for example very fast shallow draft boats, as the one you see captured in the photograph, which means they can zoom in waters that they're familiar with and basically hijack a boat, take people prisoner, and make money from taking kidnapping for ransom. One of the reasons that there's concern that this problem may get worse rather than better is that the new president in the Philippines, President Duterte, has famously launched a very violent so-called war on drugs and threatens to do the same thing with the problems in the south, and that could end very badly. At the same time, he's aligned with China and has openly spoken of breaking with the US. Just at the time, of course, when the US has a new president who may respond to such rhetoric by saying, well, if you don't want to support us, then we'll get out of here. And that may be resolved through military leadership on both sides as opposed to these civilian presidents. But the prospect is that just as things are getting worse in the Philippines, political responses may mean that there's an opportunity space for Islamic State to jump in. Now, Islamic State in general has worked on two tracks. It's had an insurgency which has given it actual territory in Iraq and Syria, which it's now losing steadily as it loses first East Mosul, now West Mosul, then in coming months this year, the city of Raqqa. But a global insurgency, which it's likely to increase its efforts at as it loses territory in the Middle East. The Middle East was its major branding exercise in having a caliphate, but even if it loses that territory, it's a threat in our region as it is around the world. Not as much as a threat as it is in Northern Africa or the Middle East, but still a threat. And Southeast Asia and Australia really need to take this threat seriously without being paranoid and exaggerating the threat. One of the reasons it's such a threat is that more than any other group in modern history, it's drawn in foreign terror fighters at a very large scale, probably of the order of 38,000 over the last 3-4 years. A third of those may now be dead. A good proportion, in the case of Europe, will have returned home. Half of them come from North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, but the other quarter, the other half, 1/4 come from Europe and a quarter come from Central and Greater Asia, including Southeast Asia and East Asia, in ways that are very complex. Australia has rates of recruitment that look like rates of recruitment in Europe, despite the fact that we would think ourselves a wealthy and stable country that wouldn't be so vulnerable. So there, of course, was a precursor to this with the conflict in Afghanistan of the 1980s that saw the birth of Al-Qaeda, but the problem in Iraq, Syria has developed 3 times more quickly with 3 times the number. It's like the Afghan conflict on steroids, and this time it's in the age of the internet and of social media. So it's a globally connected insurgency in the way that the fight against the Soviet occupation in Afghanistan wasn't. We've seen at least 600 foreign fighters from Indonesia, maybe 1,000. No one really knows for sure. We've seen an emphasis on taking families, children, young children. This vision of building a perfect utopian state, a caliphate, for a while there at least was an alluring appeal. It's lost some appeal as they're losing territory, but it's still a rising threat in terms of its capacity to energize movements across Southeast Asia. One of the reasons it's been so effective is that Southeast Asia, like most parts of the global South, like most parts of Asia, but Southeast Asia in particular, is very big on social media and has some of the world's largest Facebook and Twitter communities, and Islamic State has exploited those social media connections very effectively. At the same time, global politics, it has to be said, in an age of populist demagoguery of ultra-nationalist politics, has made it easier for Islamic State to recruit. So when Donald Trump banned immigration from 7 Muslim-majority states, ISIS turned around and said it was a blessed ban because it made their recruitment and their support so much easier to build. There's a lot of truth in that. Going back a little bit, the Pew Trust did research on expressed support for Islamic State. As you would expect in Syria, where there's a civil war, it's very high. Some people feel that ISIS is the only defender they have. Other troubled countries such as Nigeria, Tunisia, it's high. But it's hard to see why 11% of Malaysians, more than 1 in 10 Malaysians, and therefore a higher portion of young Malaysians, would express positive sentiment about ISIS. And of course, even in Indonesia, which is altogether more stable, 4% express support for ISIS, which is a small number a small proportion, but a large absolute number in a country of 265, 270 million people. We've seen a focus in ISIS propaganda too on Southeast Asia that's different, for example, from Al-Qaeda. So beginning in September 2015, they spoke explicitly about targeting Jakarta, Malaysia, at the same time talking about attacking places like Dubai, which in the past Al-Qaeda never would have deemed sensible to do, because it used such places for rest and recreation, for recruitment and for support, for banking, for logistics. There was an attempted bomb attack in KL last June. It was a hand grenade. It didn't kill anyone, fortunately. It looked like a criminal problem, but it turned out the person who threw the grenade was an ISIS supporter. This is the first time ever that an international terror group has launched an attack in Kuala Lumpur, and it surely won't be the last time such a thing is attempted. We've seen very significant levels of recruitment in Malaysia. Hundreds of individuals, some of them serving in the military and the police force, have been persuaded that somehow this so-called caliphate is legitimate. And there are complex reasons why there should be success in Malaysia in recruitment, but the way in which religion has been politicized has opened an opportunity space for extremism. So although Malaysia is a successful multicultural nation that certainly has a population that is peace-loving and wants to avoid violence, there are points of vulnerability that sees it struggling with a problem much larger than it's ever had to deal with before. Indonesia acknowledges that it has a problem, but it doesn't know how large the problem is because it's very hard. A country like Australia struggles with tracking who's leaving the country, who's arriving. For Southeast Asia, it's much harder again. So the Indonesians acknowledge that people are slipping under the radar, both leaving the country and coming back. Of course, people could leave Indonesia via a small boat to Malaysia or the Philippines or Thailand, come back by a complex route. It's not necessarily going to be obvious they're returning from Syria or Iraq. What we are seeing, and this is to do with a lag in legislation, is open recruiting for Islamic State right in the heart of Jakarta. So this mosque here in Menteng, in the old moneyed centre of the city, we see people recorded on film swearing an oath of allegiance to Islamic State. We see a massive online presence with thousands of radical sites. Of course, some of them can be shut down, but they can be replaced as quickly as they can be shut down. It's a very difficult problem to solve. And we see a background to Islamist extremism in Southeast Asia, small scale but significant, that gives a basis for Islamic State to build upon. So a quick recap of that is useful for framing this problem. Of course, we were aware, or became aware, of the sort of problem that Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, was facing in October 2002 with the Bali bombing. At the time, it was thought it may have been some sort of odd elite political contestation, given that Suharto had only stepped down 4 years earlier and there's still some fluidity. Some said it was foreign interference. There was a lot of open skepticism that there could be a domestic group capable of such a large, devastating event. It turned out, of course, that it was a domestic group, that it came out of historical roots, the Darul Islam movement of the 1940s, 50s and early 60s, a kind of separatist movement that became increasingly Islamist as it faced oppression. The Indonesian government at the time thought that brute force had eliminated that movement. Of course, we see in hindsight that multiple generations arose out of it that carried on at a smaller scale. Things became a little bit more obvious in the 1970s when, ironically, out of a counterinsurgency program of the military, there was a re-energizing of ostensible support for extremism led by Abdullah Sungkar and Abu Bakr Bashir. They were arrested in the late 70s. They were successfully able to contest their sentencing. They got out of jail in '82. And they fled shortly afterwards to Malaysia. This is at a time when the conflict against the Soviet occupation in Afghanistan was reaching a height, and they recruited hundreds, perhaps around 300 Southeast Asians from not just Indonesia but from Malaysia, from the Philippines, to travel. And in 1993, they broke with the Darul Islam movement and declared their own movement. When they returned from Afghanistan, the so-called Afghan alumni were the core of this group. Most of them did not support terrorism, or in their terms, violent jihad in Indonesia. They said it was not the time or the place, but a small minority of leaders were responsible. And even before the Bali bombing, in hindsight, it's clear that local problems in Maluku, in the east of Indonesia, and in Sulawesi, in central Sulawesi, gave an opportunity for local recruitment and local training. So conflict zones were opportunity spaces, and in the years prior to the Bali bombing, there were a series of events that at the time were not well understood. For example, Christmas Eve 2000, a series of coordinated bombings. Then after the Bali bombing, regular attempts to try and recreate, never at the same scale, those sort of attacks. So the Marriott Hotel was attacked in 2003, the Australian Embassy was attacked in 2004, there was a return to Bali in 2005. In the process of this, coming out of the Bali bombing of 2002, the Indonesian police stood up a special unit, a detachment khusus, Densus is the shortened contraction, Densus 88, Detachment 88, which has become extremely effective in counter-terror operations. You would have noticed perhaps this week in Bandung, there was an attempt to set off a bomb in a cooking pot, which was foiled, it failed, and the would-be bomber in that process was killed. But mostly there's been success in taking people in alive and prosecuting them, 1,000 plus arrests and prosecutions, considerable success in tactical responses to terrorism. So this came out of multilateral operations, but particularly bilateral operations between the Australian Federal Police and the Indonesian Police. One of the initiatives was the Jakarta Centre for Law Enforcement Cooperation, which was very effective in building tradecraft capacity for Southeast Asians, officers and others across the region. So this threat has been contained up until Islamic State emerged. The threat of terrorism was not eliminated, but was contained. There was a nasty surprises along the way. In July of 2009, there was a second attack on the Marriott Hotel and its sister hotel. And then in the wake of that, it was clear that there had been some charismatic recruiters, in this case the Malaysian Nordin Muhammad Top, had managed to successfully, time and time again, recruit young people for bombing operations. A major training camp was established in the northern tip of Sumatra, in Aceh, in 2010. But since then, the problem has been largely dealt with. It's not re-emerged until Islamic State turned up. Now the presence of Islamic State has re-energized the threat across the region. This Islamic State threat comes out of a group that was called Al-Qaeda in Iraq because Musab al-Zarqawi, a Jordanian sort of street hoodlum, a petty criminal become would-be terrorist, spent time in Al-Qaeda camps, had an uneasy relationship with Osama bin Laden and al-Zawahiri, moved to Iraq in 2002 ahead of the 2003 invasion, led an insurgency which he named Al-Qaeda in Iraq and got reluctant support from the Al-Qaeda leadership. Reluctant because he was extremely sectarian. He played upon anti-Shia sentiment in a country that was predominantly Shia. The Al-Qaeda leadership felt that this was unwise and not strategic. He was killed in an airstrike in 2006, and it looked like the problem was largely contained. Then the Sunni awakening successfully in 2007, 2008 saw this insurgency and other insurgencies largely quashed down to just a few hundred fighters. And so it was thought the threat was dealt with. But 2011, American troops pulled out. At the same time, civil war broke out in Syria, and the remnants of this group, now led by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, began to rebuild. We didn't really pay a lot of attention to them until June 2014, when they surged down the Tigris River in the center of Iraq, taking the second largest city, Mosul. Of course, Mosul is now the site of contestation to try and drive them out of Iraq. When Baghdadi declared himself a caliph and declared a caliphate, it was thought to be incredible and not likely to be taken seriously. It turns out it immediately got very serious support. This was a very powerful brand, including in Southeast Asia, and it evoked very strong support. One of the things that was associated with this brand was the idea that people should leave their home and migrate. They should make hijrah to join the utopian state. So figures from the past, such as Abu Bakr Bashir from his jail cell, declared on video their bayat, their oath of allegiance to Islamic State. And in the center of the national capital, there were open demonstrations supporting ISIS. That level of public support is being controlled now, but it's still a problem. Of course, Islamic State, so-called, embedded itself along the two river valleys, the more populated areas of these arid zones, and embedded themselves along those two river valleys in Sunni majority communities, which were feeling, in the case of Iraq, a lot of injustice and oppression from the new Shia government of Prime Minister Maliki and then current Prime Minister al-Abadi. And that gave them a sense of legitimacy as defenders of the Sunnis. Of course, they murdered the Sunnis quite relentlessly and used tactics of intimidation to control their territory, but they played upon these ethnic patterns of Sunni majorities. In the case of Iraq, a Shia majority country, but Sunni majorities in the west and in the north. And the case of Syria, a Sunni majority in a country ruled by a Shia minority. They played on those ethnic tensions and exacerbated them in ways that were very opportunistic and effective. They effectively ran a quasi-state with 12 districts in Iraq and 12 districts in Syria and 9 ministries, some of them, such as the Ministry of Media, extremely effective. At the same time, secret documents reveal a parallel state that was very much a police state, a state of intimidation and fear, using religion as a front, but basically using methods of psyops, of intimidation to control people. And so we see a strange kind of hybrid. We see the arrests of people such as the man in Young in New South Wales, 42-year-old electrician, one of the fanboys, one of the sort of global network of supporters. What we don't see is the people really controlling the movement, many of whom are former Iraqi military officers who were caught up in the de-Baathification after the occupation of Iraq in ways that are very consequential. They've used very effective messaging and media, which has grown increasingly sophisticated. In the period since Al-Qaeda, Western government and other government media hasn't really improved greatly, but Islamic State has moved on dramatically from Al-Qaeda before it. Their publications have a couple of strong themes. They stress divine judgment. They stress a world divided into two camps, the domain of war, Dar al-Harb, and the domain of Islam, Dar al-Islam. Traditional concepts, but of course distorted and misapplied. The upshot being they say that the streets of Sydney or Melbourne are zones of war, that there is an active global conflict that justifies a military response. This idea of taking sides is emphasized in their speaking out against Muslim leaders who don't support them. They say that there is no grey zone in the middle. You either support us or you don't support us. So after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, for example, they criticized imams who said "Je suis Charlie" and criticized the Muslims of Paris who didn't support them. They've attacked Shia mosques very overtly, but most of their victims, in fact, have been fellow Sunni Muslims. They justify this by saying these people are lost in ignorance, in darkness, and that the only way to overcome this ignorance is to align yourself with us, come and join us physically if you can. They, at one level, are an apocalyptic movement. That's to say they stress this idea of linear time coming to an end, an inflection point where human history will be wrapped up in a great battle, the Malahim, the great battle, which they cite in ways not dissimilar from some Christian apocalyptic cults as occurring in the Middle East. They use the name Deakin, a town in northern Syria, because it's mentioned in a weak hadith of prophecy. They use this name for their magazine, for example. So they say, come and join us. We will face many martyrs, we acknowledge that, but God is on our side, so we will prevail ultimately. And they use this for a exaggerated approach to violent jihad beyond what even Al-Qaeda has carried out in the past. They see a reversal of history where the decline of Muslim civilization will be reversed with the dramatic rising up of their pure understanding of religion. They have a message which is attractive to young people, not many young people it has to be said, but a small minority, because it is so muscular. So when consistently Muslim leaders say that Islam is a religion of peace, they say in return it's not a religion of peace, it's a religion of the sword, it's a religion of judgment and justice, which for young people is a very attractive way of presenting muscular religion. We see it across all religious traditions to some extent with modern fundamentalism. But they offer a message that's very personal as well. They say that if you make hijrah, if you migrate and come and join us, and even if you can't do that physically, at least if you do it online and in terms of your allegiance. If you come and join us, make hijrah, you'll find forgiveness, you'll find redemption. It's a redemptive narrative. So, as Al-Qaeda in the past said, you can't be a good Muslim without supporting jihad. Their formula is a little more sophisticated. They say, if you want to be a true Muslim, there's no grey zone. You've got to leave the land of darkness, of ignorance. Make hijrah, migrate, get out of home where mum cooks for you and does your laundry, and you hang out with your mates and waste your life. Make hijrah, leave that behind, join the community of the Jama, fight the Talgut, the tyrants, and support the Khilafah, the utopian Islamic state, the caliphate. And they say this is the pattern of the prophets of the past. This area, Mesopotamia, occupied by Islamic State, of course, is the area through which the Hebrew Bible and the Quran suggests the Prophet Abraham moved through on his journey to Canaan. And so they invoke this image and say, you can follow in the millah of Ibrahim, follow in the footsteps of the Prophet Abraham and join us, but you only need to board an aircraft. It's very simple. So abandon the lands of shirk, lands of superstition and misunderstanding, come to the land of Islam, of true religion where the black banner of Islamic State flies. And even if you can't do that, people like Man Harun Monis, the Lint Cafe gunman, are held up as an example of somebody whose life was going nowhere, who came from a so-called Rafidi, a Shia Persian background, but changed his allegiance and became a Sunni extremist. They hold such people up as examples of redeemed individuals who have transformed their lives and who offer an example of redemption. And they use this general pattern of fighting injustice, of carrying out divine judgment, of offering personal redemption to justify terrorism. So as we have just war, justified defensive war, when somebody, for example, World War II, when the Axis powers, Germany invades Poland and there's a response, that concept of just war is well understood, poorly executed in practice, of course, but well understood. They extend it to this idea of terrorism being part of a global battle, a global insurgency that's got shades of sort of 21st century popular culture. So this page from Deakin magazine, their e-magazine, deliberately plays on images of a Star Wars movie poster. They are successful in targeting youth popular culture as well as making a claim on older understandings of religion. Their level of appeal to foreign fighter recruitment is very variable. As mentioned earlier, it's strongest in the neighbourhood of the greater Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula, also in Turkey next door, through which many foreign fighters have come. Areas like Libya, of course, that are are suffering from chaos through political collapse, and neighbouring Tunisia, affected by the problems of its physically larger neighbour Morocco, where there's very high youth unemployment. All of that is kind of understandable, but France and Britain have very high rates of recruitment. And it's not because life in France and Britain is miserable, it's because recruiters find some way of getting to young people, young men and women who sense alienation, suffer with unemployment, who are vulnerable to recruitment. The remarkable thing is that the rates of recruitment in Australia are the same as they are in France and Britain, suggesting that this is about the pulling power of this message and this movement as much as it is about push factors at home. So they've had enormous success in Europe. As many as 5,000 to 6,000 foreign fighters have gone from Europe to Syria, Iraq. Many have since returned, planning a longer insurgency back at home. We saw this pattern earlier with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, but the numbers with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, what became Al-Qaeda out of the fight against the Soviet military occupation, saw maybe just 4,000 foreign terror fighters, another 6,000 perhaps joining them after the conflict was over, but not many seeing frontline service. Bosnia, Somalia also drew in foreign fighters, but Iraq, Syria, we're looking at between 35 and maybe as many as 40,000 foreign fighters from all around the world, including probably 1,000 plus from our region, 200 plus from Australia. It's re-energised the old Jamaat Islamiyah networks. It's in some cases not just been Islamic State, but the Al-Qaeda affiliate Jabhat al-Nusra. But the idea of the caliphate has given fresh energy into extremist movements. There's some hope, of course, the defeat of IS in West Mosul, having already been defeated in East Mosul, the second largest city, the biggest city that they're holding, and then the eventual defeat in Raqqa in Syria will see the ending of this movement. But it won't end so quickly, and there are opportunity spaces in Southeast Asia that they will try and exploit through a global insurgency. We've seen some foreshadowing of this already. Beginning of last year, January 14, there was an attempted attack in Jakarta. It wasn't very effective. The attackers were very inexperienced, largely because a more experienced team had been arrested in December 2015. So the B team turned up, the A team had been neutralised. The worry, of course, is that an A team may turn up again at some stage. There were a series of events through the course of last year, an attempted suicide bombing at a police academy that killed only the bomber. More seriously, an attempted attack on a shopping mall in Surabaya, Indonesia's second largest city, that was stopped just because of good intelligence in the neighbouring city of Malang, where the terror leader was arrested. We've seen the mass organisations of NU and Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah come together to work with community to deal with violent extremism. We've seen a recognition from the government of the need to engage in countering violent extremism approaches. We've seen pilot initiatives at rehabilitation programs in prisons. There's a general consensus we need to really get serious about dealing with the problem more holistically and take a broader approach to countering violent extremism. This broader approach has to work at prevention as well as rehabilitation. At the same time, we see Islamic State increasingly focusing on Southeast Asia along with other regions. The new magazine that came out late last year, Rumiyah, refers to Rome, Western civilization, the idea being that Western civilization is ending. Rumiyah is published in 7 languages, one of which is Malay Indonesian. Of course, famously, their English edition, the first edition, referenced an Australian fighter, Ezid Rad, who had been arrested over an earlier terror plot a decade earlier, and his young nephews and brother-in-law who got caught up in the violence. But the focus on Australia, reference to Broadmeadows and Brunswick to Bankstown and Bondi, to the MCG and the SCG and the Opera House, was a chilling call out for people to respond. It wasn't a sign of capacity, but it was certainly a sign of intent. In the Australian context, we see very tightly networked close associations, including the man, for example, arrested in Young on Thursday this week, who it turns out his uncle had been subject to arrests in 2015 for seeking to source Chinese-made surface-to-air missiles for Islamic State. He fled with his family to Syria. His nephew was under surveillance the last 18 months. That fits a familiar pattern of strong social networks. So those cases that we know about, we see this pattern time and time again, and it speaks to the need to be active in society, working with potential points of vulnerability, trying to prevent recruitment, trying to work towards particularly working with vulnerable individuals. Hundreds of young Australians have been stopped from travelling over the last 2 years to Iraq, Syria, and many of them are being followed up by community groups led by state police, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done to be effective. We understand some of the warning signs now of people being recruited. We need to pay attention to those warning signs and try and affect interventions through family and friends in the first instance, but with some expert backup to try and prevent recruitment ever occurring, or at least reverse radicalisation in its earlier stages. Most of the interventions we've done in the CVE space so far have been primary interventions. They've been aimed at the general population to build social cohesion. That's a very important, necessary thing. But we need to do more work in the secondary space. For example, these young people who have been stopped from travelling, as well as those who have been arrested or serving time in prison, the tertiary interventions. An important need in Australia. It will be more important in future. It's a very important need in Indonesia, where success by Densus has led to 1,000+ arrests, but people are normally in prison for a few years, then they're out having served their sentence, and without rehabilitation are likely to reoffend again. So in conclusion, we now understand radicalisation is largely a social process. People join a network and join a group before they internalise the ideology. But ideology narrative is very important. This narrative of the caliphate is very powerful. Even if it's physically defeated on the ground, it will still be very powerful. We need to work at this problem for the long run. We need to try and prevent recruitment as best we can. We'll also need to work at rehabilitation where that's not always possible. And there's broad consensus of the need to do this. Doing it particularly in the secondary and the tertiary intervention spaces is challenging, but there is at least consensus across our region, across Southeast Asia. We need to work together on this, and if we do it well, it can actually enrich society and make society better. So given that we're dealing with a minor problem that's not an existential threat but takes enormous resources, it's important that we respond to this problem in ways that actually build society.
Thank you so much. That was a really insightful presentation. Now we have time for questions, so I'll give you a few minutes to pop in your questions now. So just to let you know, Professor Greg Barton has agreed to share the presentation with anyone who may be interested. So you can email me at deakinalumni@deakin.edu.au and I can share a copy with you. So our first question, what would be the most important thing our government could do to assist Indonesia with this problem?
Well, there's no one thing that we can do. The good news is that the response to the Bali bombing of October 2002 resulted in some very practical bilateral cooperation. It helped the Indonesians set up their Detachment 88. It led to the establishment of the Jakarta Centre for Law Enforcement Cooperation, which, despite the name, is actually in Semarang in the National Police Academy. And that's been very effective in training not just Indonesian police, but police from around Southeast Asia and people from other backgrounds. All of that has to do with sort of tactical responses to counter-terrorism. So in the last 2 years, there's been recognition of the need to work more holistically alongside that to also do the countering violent extremism, the CVE piece. And there isn't a single one thing that we can do, but it's clear that in terms of CVE interventions, Indonesia needs to work harder on tertiary interventions in the prison space and prisoners leaving prison. Those who are detained, 1,000 plus on terrorism charges. It also needs to work with community groups in trying to prevent recruitment. It needs to make some amendments to legislation to make it easier to prosecute. At the moment you can leave the country, go to Syria, come back, and it's very hard to charge people. People have been charged, it does happen, but the legal framework is difficult. That's something for Indonesia to sort out. But there can be discussions about what works in terms of legislation, there can be sharing of experience. But there can be, and this has to happen in the spirit of cooperation. Australia is not superior to Indonesia in this space, but we face a common threat. We can learn some things together. And one of the things we can learn together is how we do the interventions with youth at risk, secondary interventions to try and prevent or reverse recruitment, and how we do the tertiary interventions for those who already got caught up in trouble. For Indonesia and the rest of Southeast Asia, as hundreds of people possibly return from the conflict zone, particularly as the caliphate physically begins to crumble, that's going to be a real pressing issue. We need to basically carry on in the direction that we are carrying on, but to accelerate this idea of secondary and tertiary interventions.
Thanks, Greg. What do you think is the role of the ASEAN in fighting extremism in SEEA, Southeast Asia?
Of the ASEAN?
In fighting extremism in...
Oh, it's ASEAN, yes, yeah. Okay, yes. ASEAN is, of course, a regional forum for Southeast Asian nations, and we could have a long discussion about how effective it's been or not effective. It has a policy of non-interference, and some people see that as making it less effective than it could be. But it has to be said ASEAN has continued to perform better than critics would expect. The important thing is there is a community now that identifies through the ASEAN framework, and the JCLEC training centre at the police academy in Semarang has proven very successful in working across the ASEAN nations in building capacity. That's tactical capacity to respond to terror threats. Now we need to try and replicate the same thing through ASEAN mechanisms to collectively develop the capacity to counter violent extremism, to prevent recruitment, radicalisation, to reverse it, to effect rehabilitation. So ASEAN by itself isn't a vehicle for magically making problems resolve themselves, but the fact that you have Southeast Asian nations working in a community now, and that perhaps owes success not just to ASEAN but also to AirAsia and to cheap travel and to people moving around the region. But ASEAN plays a role in terms of a collective Southeast Asian identity. Australia's been privileged to be included in many of those discussions beyond ASEAN. And I think that the more we can do in that broad frame of cooperation, the better for everyone. Such multilateral cooperation, of course, is often difficult to make very effective. The best cooperation tends to be bilateral, but starting with a multilateral forum like ASEAN is a good way to encouraging those multilateral interventions between Singapore and Indonesia, between Malaysia and Singapore, Australia and Indonesia. There's a lot of things that we can do in terms of building capacity, basically.
Thanks, Greg. Our next question from Glenn. How much does biased reporting on popular media, such as print and broadcast, encourage increase in radicalism?
Well, we need to be cautious of thinking that anything about this problem is simple. So sometimes media reporting is simplistic, and that's a problem in itself. But conversely, we can't solve this problem just by changing media reporting. And media, to be fair, will always look for stories on breaking events and report on them. That's what media has to do. Donald Trump can complain about the media, but it's not going away. But what is important is that we understand that modern terrorism is a struggle for hearts and minds. It's very much about emotional persuasion as well as intellectual persuasion. And the way we talk about each other, the way that we portray Muslims in particular, very much shapes how easy or difficult it is for recruiters to come along and say they don't respect you, they hate you, they don't think you're part of Australia, they don't think you're part of Indonesia, whatever it might be. So we I think most sensibly can work with media to be more sophisticated in the way that we talk about these things. And to give credit where credit is due, I think media reporting in general has improved year on year. And for example, when a drug-addled, unstable individual in a murderous rage drives his car at pedestrians on Burke Street in the middle of Melbourne, some initial media reports described it as terrorism, but very quickly the media said this is not terrorism, it's some hateful crime of mass murder, and it was recognised that it wasn't terrorism. Similarly, when a French-Algerian backpacker attacked his friends in a hostel outside Townsville, even though he may have used the words Allahu Akbar, God is great, in his murderous rage, media very quickly recognised this was not a terror attack, it was a deranged individual. So to be fair, media has got better at this than it has in the past. The problem perhaps at the moment is less about media per se and more about our political discourse. So when we have Islamophobic groups like the Q Society in Melbourne, and where the Q Society and other such groups get the support of elected officials such as Senator Cory Bernardi or George Christensen, that's a concern because it undermines the government, it undermines the general political response, it lowers the tone of political discourse, and it plays into the hands of recruiters. It's not directly supporting terrorism, but it makes the job of recruiters easier. That's why, for example, ISIS greeted Donald Trump's ban on those 7 Muslim-majority countries as being a blessed ban because it made their job easier. And that's actually the bigger challenge for us. It's easy to blame the media, but the bigger challenge is our national discourse in general.
Thanks, Greg. Next question from Peter. It seems much of the targeting for recruitment is of teenage people. I suggest that there is a level of disenchantment by many young people with modern society, for example, of the current Australian political system. Do you think there are any drivers for disenchantment with Australian Muslim youth compared to the general young adult population? What can be done to connect young Muslims with young non-Muslims to enable them to have a dialogue and share their concerns and create shared ways forward?
I think those are good questions, and the sort of instinct in the questions is sound, but we need to be a little bit cautious. On the one hand, it's true that a group like Islamic State, more than Al-Qaeda, targets teenagers, certainly 20-somethings, but also school-aged teenagers, much more than Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was very fussy about who it would recruit. It had a very tough filtering process. Islamic State basically will sign anyone up and encourage a total stranger to act in their name and then proclaim them to be a hero. So it's a broad funnel, it's a very crude instrumentalist approach to crowdsourcing, and it's targeting young people Now, the young people are easy to target when they're feeling alienation and they don't have strong social connection. But if we suggest that the problem is just driven by alienation, then it wouldn't explain why the problems we have in Melbourne and Sydney are equal to the problems in Paris and Marseille, when the social problems on the ground, the push factors, are arguably greater in the case of France or indeed of many British cities. So I think that part of the issue we're seeing here is not just alienation, but also very effective use of social networks, social media, friendship as a mechanism for recruitment, often online, which doesn't rely solely on alienation and on push factors, but also on the pull factor of this very powerful brand of caliphate and very effective recruitment networks. Having said that, I completely agree with the sentiment that we need to work on building social cohesion, encouraging dialogue. In general, and recent studies reported this last week bear this out, the more people get to know each other at the individual level, the more non-Muslims mix with Muslims, vice versa, the less they will be living in a world of imagined difference, and the less they'll succumb to prejudice and misunderstanding, and the more they'll form strong social bonds that will build capital and build social cohesion. In the CVE context, this is called primary intervention, but one of the dilemmas we face is because this is the easiest thing to do, there's a danger it might be the only thing we do, and we need to do this, but at the same time look for those individuals who are particularly vulnerable, and that means we need to work with community so that family and friends can speak up and identify individuals who are struggling, and we make targeted secondary interventions to those individuals. The Islamic Council of Victoria just this last month announced an initiative for a hotline which people could call between 6 a.m. and midnight about any problems they have, bullying at school, drug and alcohol problems, relationship problems, but also recruitment, so that there could be these targeted secondary interventions. So we do need to work on social cohesion and dialogue, and anything in this space that we can do is basically worth pursuing. But we also need to look at more targeted interventions.
Thanks, Greg. Glenn, who previously inquired about biased reporting in the media, has inquired, how do we promote responsible journalism?
I think we're sort of moving in that direction. As I said, credit where credit is due. There's a lot of things to be concerned about with media reporting, but I think one of the things we need to do is give credit when credit is due. So when a media outlet tries to deal with the complexities of an issue in a way that doesn't use prejudicial language, that doesn't generalise the problem, that doesn't sort of blame just one community, we need to recognise that and acknowledge it. So the conversation that we have as a nation around the media, which we increasingly have in some media programs but also in social media, needs to identify sort of best practice. It's sort of identify when somebody's done a good job and say that's a good way of handling the issue, and to politely speak critically to when it's being done badly. And we are seeing that beginning to happen in the media. So to be fair, the instances of biased and shallow reporting are increasingly outweighed by an effort to try and understand the issues. One of the things that we need to do more, though, is to have more, frankly, non-Anglo faces on our television screens, and more Muslims in the conversation when we talk about problems affecting Muslim communities. That will naturally correct some of the misunderstandings that come from having discussants who don't have personal experience.
Thank you, Greg. Next question from Peter. Are there Hearts and Minds programs in Australia that could be considered in some sense targeted to anti-terrorism or anti-violent extremism? If so, by who are they auspiced?
Well, there are many programs that seek to build social cohesion, the sort of general primary intervention, as well as some programs doing secondary interventions. I think one of the things that we're learning about countering violent extremism is that it, as a term like counter-terrorism or any other term we can think of, automatically acquires some baggage, and some people recoil from the term CVE or CT and feel it to be a tainted term. There aren't any perfect terms, so I don't think we can solve this just by looking for the perfect term. But what it does mean is that when a community is doing, or a group is doing good work in what we might recognise as being countering violent extremism, we don't have to label it as such. So a lot of the work that's being done at the moment, I mean, the example I gave of the Islamic Council of Victoria with the national hotline, that hotline is for people to call in, Muslim parents to speak to other Muslim parents, Muslim young people to speak to other Muslims about all sorts of personal problems, which may include concerns about recruitment and radicalisation. I think that speaks to the way forward. We don't have to narrowly define things in terms of CVE, and we should be cautious, particularly when we're working on the side of government, damaging good initiatives by putting government branding or stepping into overtly into the space where communities are doing good work. There's not time to articulate all of the initiatives currently going on, but there are many programs around Australia that have been working quietly and very effectively. Some of them, of course, there's always trial and error in the space and things don't always work. But I think we need to basically be prepared to get behind community groups, give them a go, let them try something. If it works, build on it. If it doesn't work, try something else.
Thanks, Greg. We're almost running out of time, so we'll answer one more question. What sort of education should our schools be including in their curriculum, assuming you believe that this should be there?
Yeah, I think we need to approach this with real wisdom and grace and care. First of all, as I said at the beginning of this discussion, terrorism is not an existential threat. So if we frame it as being an existential threat, then we exaggerate the threat out of proportion to other threats. I do think we need to acknowledge that domestic violence, youth suicide, other problems involving, for example, drug and alcohol abuse and violent assault are bigger problems by far than terrorism. And so we shouldn't overly foreground terrorism. But there are some things we can do. I think we need to look at school curriculums when it comes to history and discussions of international affairs, politics, to try and present not so much a variety of opinions, but a diversity of perspectives. So we are a multicultural society, and we should acknowledge that there are different ways of thinking about history and different ways of thinking about which things are important. The days in which we only focused on sort of British history or European history and ignored Australian history are thankfully largely past, but we need to, in talking about the world today, acknowledge, for example, that the invasion of Iraq in 2003 is widely criticised. Not everyone agrees with it. In fact, probably the majority of security specialists and serving military officers agree that it was unwise and that mistakes were made. Not intentionally, but unintentionally, and have a conversation about that. Create safe spaces in the classroom to discuss international affairs. We don't have to give a prescriptive answer, but if somebody can ask a question and say, why do I see, for example, drone attacks against so-called terrorists in Pakistan that kill so many civilians? We need to be able to discuss that safely in the school environment. And there's no simple answers there, but if we don't have that conversation at school, then kids will look for it online, and they will find potentially much more biased discussion online. And the danger is they end up in a world where they're told to trust nothing they see at school or in the media, and to trust only what they find with their new friends. So there's something we can do in the education space to counter that. Of course, there's the broader discussion about respect for diversity, for difference. We should have greater literacy about religious identity and religious convictions and practice, and the diversity within communities as well as across communities, so that Australians understand our nation better and feel more comfortable with difference and diversity, and feel that it's safe to have discussions about difference and diversity. Now, we do a lot of that very well already, but that's always an area we can work out much better in. Our media environment looks more diverse than it did even a decade ago. But we've still got a long way to go. We need to try and create opportunities for including different voices. And if we're talking about the Muslim world and Muslim problems, then include Muslim voices in a way that opens up the discussion rather than leave some people feeling they're excluded.
Thank you, Greg. That's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for your time today, Professor Greg Barton, and thank you to our audience for tuning in and participating in the discussion. Remember, you can submit feedback to deakinalumni@deakin.edu.au, and a recording of the presentation will be available on our website within the next few weeks. Greg Barton has shared his email address displayed on the screen, so if your question has not been answered, feel free to get in touch with him. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.